Flames were already burning his legs when the firefighter pulled the doctor from the wreck. He had no idea the man he was saving was the same one who held him, fighting for life, 30 years before. This is the true story of a rescue that came full circle, a debt repaid across decades in the midst of a blazing car crash. The firefighter was Chris Trokey. The doctor was Michael Shannon. Their story is a documented medical miracle, a loop of life and debt that took 3 decades to close. But to understand the profound weight of that moment in the wreckage, you have to go back to where the loop began, with a 2-pound baby whose first breath was a fight for survival. In the neonatal intensive care unit at Mission Hospital in Mission Viejo, California, a pediatrician named Michael Shannon looked down at an infant so small he could fit in the palm of a single hand. The baby boy had been born precipitously early, weighing just 2 pounds and 3 ounces. His skin was translucent, his lungs underdeveloped. The charts gave him a 50-50 chance. This was Chris Trokey. His panicked parents had rushed him to the ER with a perilously high temperature, and now he was fighting the first and most basic battle of his life, the battle to breathe. Dr. Shannon was known for a particular kind of dedication. He treated countless children over his decades-long career, but it was the most fragile cases, the ones who needed him most, that stuck in his memory and commanded his every resource. With baby Chris, he made a decision that went beyond standard protocol. He would not just treat this infant from the hallway or the nurse's station. He would stay. Night after night, after his official shift ended, Dr. Shannon would pull a chair up to the isolette, the clear plastic incubator that was Chris Trokey's first world. He would watch the steady blip of the heart monitor, adjust the oxygen levels with minute care, and talk softly to the baby, as if willing strength into him through sheer presence. Chris's parents, exhausted and terrified, would find the doctor there in the early morning hours having catnapped in that chair. He became a fixed point in the chaos of their nightmare. They didn't know yet that this man was implanting himself as a permanent figure in their son's origin story, a guardian angel written into the very first chapter. Week bled into week. The 50-50 odds slowly tipped. Chris gained ounces. His lungs grew stronger. The day he was finally discharged, swaddled in a blanket that still seemed to swallow him, was a quiet victory. Dr. Shannon shook the parents' hands, filed the case away in his mind as one of the good ones, and moved on to the next child who needed him. He had no reason to think he would ever see that baby again. Medicine is a field of fleeting, intense connections. You give everything to save a life, and then that life goes out into the world and you remain. For Michael Shannon, Chris Trokey became a memory. A good memory, but a memory nonetheless. Meanwhile, the baby he saved was growing up, and something about that brutal, fragile start to life seemed to instill in Chris Trokey a profound pull toward the edge of crisis. He didn't become a doctor. He became something else entirely. He was drawn to fire, to chaos, to the moment when everything goes wrong. He became a firefighter and a paramedic. He joined the crew of Paramedic Engine 29, serving the same Orange County communities where he had once fought for his own life. His job was now to run toward the very disasters that most people flee. He saw car wrecks, house fires, medical emergencies that arrived in a scream of sirens. He developed the calm, efficient demeanor of a professional rescuer, a man who could look at sheer wreckage and see a series of logical problems to solve: extricate, stabilize, transport. And through all those years, Dr. Michael Shannon continued his work. He delivered bobbies, treated childhood illnesses, guided thousands of families through the ordinary and extraordinary crises of growing up. He was, by all accounts, a fixture, a kind, steady presence in a community that trusted him implicitly. The two men, savior and saved, lived their parallel lives, separated by a generation in age and a universe in daily experience. One fought disease in quiet exam rooms. The other fought fire and metal on screaming highways. Then, on March 29, 2011, a semi-truck on the Pacific Coast Highway veered out of its lane. The impact with Dr. Shannon's SUV was catastrophic. The vehicle spun, smashed against the guardrail and erupted into flames. Inside, Michael Shannon was trapped, his legs already burning, dense smoke filling the cabin. This is where the loop begins to tighten. The call went out, and within minutes, paramedic Engine 29 was on scene. Chris Trokey saw what all firefighters see first: the dark plume of smoke, then the orange bloom of fire. He saw the crumpled shape of the SUV. His training took over. The crew worked as one unit, attacking the flames with foam and water, trying to buy time. The priority was the driver, still moving inside. Trokey moved in with the jaws of life, the massive hydraulic spreader that can peel a car open like a tin can. The noise was deafening: the roar of the fire, the whine of the saw, the crunch of metal. He didn't look at the driver's face. He looked at the problem. A door pinned, a steering column collapsed, a man trapped. With focused precision, they peeled the wreckage back. They extracted Dr. Shannon, placed him on a backboard, and rushed him into the ambulance. Trokey helped load him in, his mind already moving to the next task: the cleanup, the report. It was a severe rescue, but in the career of a firefighter, not an uncommon one. The ambulance raced away, carrying the critically injured doctor back toward Mission Hospital, the very same hospital where, 30 years prior, he had arrived as a frantic parent with a dying baby. The following days were a haze of pain and procedure for Michael Shannon. He would spend 45 days in the hospital. He suffered internal injuries. The burns on his legs were severe enough to require the amputation of 2 of his toes. Through the morphine and the surgeries, he was dimly aware of the people who had pulled him from the fire. He felt a deep, inarticulate gratitude, but he was in no condition to seek anyone out. Back at the fire station, Chris Trokey and his crew debriefed. They talked about the extraction, the techniques that worked. The driver's identity was just a name on a report: Michael Shannon. It meant nothing special to Trokey. He had saved dozens of people with dozens of names. He hoped the man would pull through. But a few days later, something nagged at Chris. Maybe it was the name. Maybe it was the strange coincidence of the hospital. He decided to visit the victim, a gesture of goodwill that some first responders make. He walked into the hospital room, introduced himself as one of the firefighters from the crash. The man in the bed, bandaged and weak, looked at him. And then Dr. Michael Shannon, his memory jolted by a name he hadn't heard in 3 decades, asked a question that would change both their lives forever. He looked at the grown man, this strong, capable firefighter standing before him, and he said, "Were you born prematurely?" The question hung in the sterile hospital air. Chris Trokey, standing in his uniform, froze. For a second, the noise of the room, the beep of monitors, the murmur of the hallway faded away. Yes, he said, his voice quiet with confusion. "I was 2 pounds 3 ounces. They said it was 50-50. A profound, weary smile spread across Michael Shannon's bandaged face. Tears welled in his eyes. "I know," he whispered. "I was there. I'm your pediatrician." The floor seemed to shift under Chris Trokey's feet. The man in the bed wasn't just a victim he'd pulled from a wreck. He was the architect of his own existence, the guardian from the stories his parents told. The name on the report suddenly had weight, history, a face from his earliest memories. He slowly sat down in the chair beside the bed, the structural confidence of the firefighter momentarily gone. "Dr. Shannon," he said, the title feeling both foreign and deeply familiar. What followed was a conversation that unraveled 30 years in an afternoon. Shannon, through the pain, recounted details only a doctor who had been relentlessly present would know: the specific complications, the long nights, the palpable relief when Chris finally turned a corner. Chris listened, hearing his own origin story narrated by the man who had written it, sentence by medical sentence. The coincidence was so vast, so statistically improbable, that it felt less like chance and more like fate, with a cruel, poetic sense of timing. Shannon had entered Chris's life when it was at its most fragile beginning. Chris had re-entered Shannon's when it was at its most violent rupture. News of the miraculous connection spread through the hospital staff like an electric current. Nurses who had worked with Dr. Shannon for years came by, eyes wide, shaking their heads in disbelief. The story had a pristine mythic quality. The saved becomes the savior. It was a perfect circle, but perfect circles are rare in real life, and this one was about to be tested by the harsh, linear reality of recovery. Because Michael Shannon's injuries were severe, the 45-day hospital stay was a gauntlet of surgeries, skin grafts, and agonizing physical therapy. The amputation of his 2 toes meant relearning how to walk, how to balance. The pain was a constant companion. And here, the dynamic between the 2 men began its subtle, powerful shift. Chris Trokey started visiting regularly, not as a firefighter making a courtesy call, but as something else entirely: a friend, a supporter, a living reminder to Shannon that survival was worth the brutal cost. He'd come after his shift still in his uniform and sit with the doctor. Sometimes they talked about the accident. Sometimes they talked about firefighting or medicine. Often they talked about Chris's own young family. Shannon, even in his diminished state, would slip back into his pediatrician's role, asking after Chris's wife, offering advice. The debt, which seemed so clear at first, a life for a life, was becoming muddled. Who was helping whom? Then a local news reporter got a tip. The story of the firefighter who saved the doctor who saved him was catnip for television. It aired first on a regional broadcast, a 2-minute feel-good segment about karma and full circles. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The story was picked up by national networks, by magazines, by online outlets. Overnight, Chris Trokey and Michael Shannon were no longer just a private marvel, they were a public symbol. They were invited onto talk shows. Their story was framed as an antidote to cynicism, a real-life parable about how good deeds echo across time. But the spotlight, while warm, added a new layer of pressure. Their personal, hard-won connection was now a narrative product. People expected them to be perpetually grateful, perpetually in awe of the coincidence. They were asked repeatedly to perform their amazement for the camera. For Trokey, a private man used to the camaraderie of the firehouse, it was disorienting. For Shannon, trying to concentrate on the grueling work of walking again, it was a draining distraction. And then came the first major pivot, the moment that reframed everything. During an interview for a major magazine, the reporter asked a seemingly innocuous question. "Dr. Shannon, after treating thousands of children, how did you remember Chris Trokey so specifically after 30 years? Shannon paused. He looked older under the lights, the pain of his recovery etched around his eyes. His answer was quiet, and it changed the entire emotional geometry of their story. "I didn't," he said. The reporter leaned forward. Shannon continued. "I mean, I remembered the case. A very premature infant, tough odds, a good outcome. But when Chris told me his name in that hospital room, it didn't ring a bell. Not at first." He went on to explain that it was only later, when Chris mentioned the specific hospital, Mission Hospital, and his parents' names, that the memory snapped into vivid, technicolor focus. "The ones who need you most," Shannon said, "they don't always stick in your memory as a name. They stick as a feeling of fighting alongside them. When all the details came back, that's when I knew him, not from his chart, but from that feeling." This admission was profoundly human, and it shattered the divine destiny frame the media had built. It wasn't that Shannon had carried Chris Trokey's name in his heart for 30 years, waiting for this moment. It was that the act of saving a life creates a bond that exists outside of memory. It lives in the muscles, in the instinct, in the professional marrow of a person. Shannon had saved a life, and that act had subtly shaped the man he was. Trokey had saved a life, and that act had unknowingly connected him to his own past. The circle wasn't about recognition, it was about action. This new understanding deepened their private relationship. The media circus gradually died down, as these things do, leaving them in a quieter space. They began meeting for coffee, then for lunches. Shannon, as he regained mobility, even visited Fire Station 29. He saw the other side of the rescue, the waiting, the equipment, the camaraderie. He saw Chris in his element, and he understood the kind of man the fragile baby had become. A year after the accident, they made a quiet pact. They would meet every year on March 29th, the anniversary of the crash, not for publicity but for themselves, to acknowledge the loop, to check in, to be grateful for the strange, winding path that kept intersecting their lives. The first anniversary was at a small diner. Shannon walked in with a slight limp, but he walked in on his own. Trokey stood up to greet him, and they hugged. A real, solid hug between two men who owed each other everything and nothing at all. It was at that first anniversary lunch that Chris shared news of his own. His wife was pregnant, their first child. Shannon's eyes lit up with pure professional joy, and then Chris asked the question that would create a new, smaller loop within the first. "Will you be his pediatrician?" he asked. Shannon, who was nearing retirement, didn't hesitate. "It would be the honor of my career," he said. So when baby Porter Trokey was born in 2015, Dr. Michael Shannon was there. He examined the healthy, full-term infant in the same hospital system where he had once fought for the baby who was now the father. He held Porter, and the symmetry was almost overwhelming. For 2 years, Shannon was Porter's doctor. He guided Chris and his wife through the ordinary wonders and worries of their son's first years. He retired in 2017, passing Porter's care to a trusted colleague, his own work finally fully complete. The story, it seemed, had reached its natural, beautiful conclusion. A life saved in return, and a new life ushered in under the same watchful eye. It was the kind of ending that makes you believe in order in the universe. But a single thread was left dangling, a thread few people knew to look for, and it was about to pull tight. Because while Chris Trokey and Michael Shannon had this profound personal connection, there was another man living with a similar yet unresolved story. A retired firefighter named Ike Randolph. For 33 years, Randolph had kept a yellowed newspaper clipping in his locker. It showed him, decades younger, carrying a small boy from the smoke and flames of a house fire. He had saved that child's life. And for 33 years he had wondered, what happened to the boy? Did he survive? Did he thrive? The newspaper clipping was a question mark he could never answer. He had tried on and off to search, but in the pre-internet age, the trail went cold. Ike Randolph's story was the shadow to Trokey and Shannon's light. It represented the other possible outcome of a rescue, a lifetime of not knowing. His quiet, persistent wondering was about to collide with the very public tale of the firefighter and the doctor, setting in motion a final, unexpected escalation that would test what it really means to be saved. Ike Randolph's story existed in the silent space between the dramatic rescue and the final, fulfilling reunion. It was the more common, unspoken chapter. For 33 years, the newspaper clipping lived in his locker, then later in a drawer at home. The photo showed a younger version of himself, his face smudged with soot, cradling a small, limp boy wrapped in a blanket. The headline read, "Firefighter Saves Toddler from Blaze." The article gave the boy's name, Jacob. He was 2 years old. That was all Ike ever knew. He retired from the fire department. He had a family, grandchildren, but the question never left him. He'd look at the clipping every few years, the paper growing more brittle, the image fading. "When you have a picture that reminds you over and over," he once said, "it's just the kind of hope. You want to know he turned out okay." He had tried in the early 90s to find the family. Pre-internet, it was a dead end. The trail was cold. He'd make a call, hit a wall, and put the clipping away again. The loop of not knowing left open. Then the story of Chris Trokey and Dr. Shannon went viral. Ike saw it on the news like everyone else. He felt the same awe, the same warmth. But for him, it also ignited a specific, painful envy. They had found each other. Their circle was closed. His remained a frayed end. The public celebration of their connection was a mirror held up to his own unresolved wondering. It wasn't bitterness. It was a renewed sense of possibility. If their 30-year loop could close, maybe his 33-year one could too. This time, the tools were different. The rise of social media and public databases had changed the game. A family member, seeing how the story affected Ike, suggested a new approach. They could share the newspaper clipping online, not as a demand but as a question. Does anyone know what happened to the boy in this photo? They posted it on a community page for the upstate New York town where the fire had happened. They braced for silence. They did not get silence. The post was shared, then shared again, hundreds of times, thousands. The algorithm, indifferent to human longing, nonetheless did its work. It reached people who had lived in that neighborhood in the late 80s. It reached former teachers, distant relatives. And 48 hours later, it reached a woman named Sarah. Sarah was Jacob's older sister. She saw the photo and felt the world drop away. There was her baby brother, Jacob. There was the firefighter whose name they had never known. She called her mother, her voice trembling. Within hours, Sarah was on the phone with Ike Randolph's family. Yes, Jacob was alive. Yes, he was okay, more than okay. He was 26 years old. He was a teacher. He had a daughter of his own. The news was everything Ike had hoped for 3 decades. But then Sarah's voice changed. She said, "Jacob. He doesn't really remember the fire. We never talked about it much. It was too traumatic for my parents. I don't know how he'll react to this." This was the first complication, the wait. It gets more delicate moment. Ike's deepest hope was about to confront a complex reality. The person you save carries the event differently than you do. For the rescuer, it's a defining moment of purpose and heroism. For the rescued, especially a toddler, it can be a buried trauma, a ghost in the foundation of their life. Jacob Tsukroff had built a good life consciously away from that night. He knew he'd been in a fire, but the details were foggy, second-hand stories. The firefighter was a vague concept, not a man with a face and a name and a 33-year longing. The families arranged a phone call. Ike, now in his 70s, his voice still bearing the calm, firm tone of a commander, spoke to the young man he'd pulled from the flames. The conversation was warm but awkward. Jacob was polite, grateful, but understandably guarded. This was a stranger claiming a profound connection to the most terrifying day of his early life. They agreed to meet. The meeting was set for a park near where Jacob lived. Now the story of Trokey and Shannon provided an unexpected template, but also a heavy burden of expectation. The media, catching wind of this second long-lost firefighter reunion, descended. Cameras were there when Ike Randolph and Jacob Tsukroff met in person for the first time since that smoke-filled night. They shook hands, they hugged, they smiled for the pictures. It made for another beautiful minute-long news segment, another closed loop, another happy ending. But in the quiet after the cameras left, something more real and more important began. The two men went for a walk, and Ike, perhaps wiser from seeing the Trokey-Shannon story unfold, didn't press for a deep, instant bond. He simply said, "I just needed to know you were okay." And Jacob, disarmed by the simplicity of that, began to ask his own questions. What was the fire like? How did you find me? What was I like when you carried me out? For the first time, Jacob was hearing the story from the other side, from the perspective of the man running into the house he was fleeing. Ike described the heat, the sound of the roof groaning, the feeling of Jacob's small, hot body going limp in his arms as the smoke overcame him. He talked about the rush to the ambulance, the fear that he was too late. He talked about the relief at the hospital when they said the boy would survive. He talked about wondering, every year after, on the anniversary of the fire. This was the second, deeper revelation. The rescue wasn't a single moment. For Ike, it was a lifetime of narrative. He had been carrying not just Jacob's body out of that house, but the story of Jacob's potential future. By sharing that narrative, he was handing Jacob a piece of his own history, seen through a lens of care and hope. Jacob listened, and the vague ghost of a memory began to take on specific, human shape. The firefighter had a name. He had a face that aged. He had wondered about him. This new, quieter connection between Ike and Jacob started to reframe the very public, almost mythic connection between Trokey and Shannon. It showed the other valid form these relationships can take. Not all rescues lead to a dramatic role reversal 30 years later. Some lead to a gentle, late-life acquaintance. Some are about the simple, profound peace of knowing the story had a good next chapter. For Ike, the open loop in his heart was finally, gently, tied off. He could look at the newspaper clipping now not as a question, but as the first page of a story whose ending he finally knew. But just as this seemed to settle, a third, unsettling wave began to build. The viral nature of these stories had a ripple effect no one anticipated. It created a cultural appetite, a template. News programs started running segments asking, "Have you ever wondered what happened to the person you saved?" Or, "Are you someone who was rescued and wants to find your hero?" This well-intentioned media framing had a dangerous side effect. It set an expectation that every rescue asterisk should asterisk have a storybook reunion. It put pressure on both rescuers and the rescued to perform a specific kind of gratitude and connection. And in the world of firefighting and emergency response, this touched a nerve. Because for every Chris Trokey or Ike Randolph, there are hundreds of firefighters and paramedics who carry memories of people they could not save, or people they did save but whose outcomes were complicated, tragic, or unknown. The spotlight on these miraculous reunions, while beautiful, inadvertently cast a shadow on the more common, less cinematic reality of the job. You save a life, and then you let it go. You rarely get to know what happens next. That is the professional contract. Some veteran first responders began speaking up, gently pushing back against the karma loop narrative. They argued respectfully that celebrating these extraordinary reunions was fine, but the real honor was in the act itself, performed without any expectation of future reward or even future knowledge. The reward is in the doing. The moral weight of the Trokey Shannon story, they suggested, wasn't in the miraculous coincidence. It was in the fact that both men, at two separate points in time, simply did their jobs with extraordinary dedication. Shannon didn't save a baby because he thought that baby would one day pull him from a car. Trokey didn't save a driver because he suspected it was his pediatrician. They did it because someone was in need, and they were there. This public conversation added a new layer of complexity to our understanding of the core story. It asked the audience to look past the satisfying circle and see the straight, parallel lines of duty that made the circle possible. It was a necessary correction, a sobering moment that deepened the stakes from emotional to philosophical. And it was into this more nuanced, charged atmosphere that the final, most personal escalation occurred. Chris Trokey was on a routine medical call, a chest pain case. The patient was a man in his 60s, anxious, struggling to breathe. As Trokey and his partner worked to assess him, administer oxygen, and prepare for transport, the man kept saying, "I don't want to die, my grandson's birthday is next week." Trokey, with his calming paramedic's demeanor, reassured him. They got him to the hospital, standard procedure. A few days later, Trokey felt an odd, persistent fatigue, then a tightness in his own chest during a workout at the firehouse. He brushed it off as stress, poor sleep, but the tightness returned, sharper, while he was playing with his son Porter in the backyard. This time, it was accompanied by a cold sweat and a dizzying wave of nausea. He sat down on the grass, trying to catch his breath. His wife saw his pale face and called 911. The ambulance that arrived was from a different station. The paramedics who loaded him in were strangers. As they raced toward the hospital, one of them looked at his chart, then at his face. "Hey," the paramedic said, "aren't you that firefighter, the one who saved his doctor?" Trokey, in too much pain to answer, just nodded. The irony was as thick as the pain in his chest. The man who had become a symbol of rescue was now completely, utterly dependent on it. At the hospital, the diagnosis was swift and serious: a significant heart attack, a blocked artery. The very organ that symbolizes life and connection was betraying him. He was rushed into surgery for a stent placement. Lying on the gurney, staring at the blinding ceiling lights, a terrifying thought cut through the medication haze. What if my loop is closed? What if I saved the doctor, he saved my son, and that's where my story ends? The man who had defined his life by running toward other people's crises was now the crisis. And the person he most wanted to talk to, the living proof that survival was possible, was an elderly, retired doctor who had himself been pulled from wreckage, a man who walked with a limp and missing toes. As they wheeled him into the cath lab, Chris Trokey understood the final, brutal symmetry. The circle wasn't a neat story. It was a wheel, and it could roll over you at any time. He had entered the second great fight of his life, and this time, Michael Shannon couldn't hold his hand through the night. The loop was about to be tested not by coincidence, but by the cruel, random machinery of the human body. The procedure was a success, but the real fight was just beginning. In the cardiac recovery unit, Chris Trokey faced a new enemy: vulnerability. The stent was in place, blood flow restored, but his identity was in pieces. He was a firefighter, a paramedic, a rescuer, a man defined by strength and action. Now he was a patient who needed help to sit up. The psychological wall was harder to scale than the physical one. He kept thinking of the man he'd treated for chest pain just days before, the fear in his eyes. He now had that same fear in his own. Michael Shannon got the call from Chris's wife. The old doctor's heart, the metaphorical one, sank. He drove to the hospital immediately, the familiar route now charged with a terrible new significance. When he walked into the room, he didn't see the strong firefighter who had pulled him from a car. He saw a man who looked pale, tired, and scared. Shannon didn't offer platitudes. He pulled a chair to the bedside, just as he had decades ago beside an isolette. He said, "Tell me what the cardiologist said, word for word." And so their roles completed a final, quiet swap. Chris, the patient, reported the medical facts. Shannon, the doctor, listened, decoded, and explained. He became Chris's medical translator, his advocate, his guide through the bewildering landscape of cardiac rehab, medications, and lifestyle changes. But he also became something more simple, a friend who had been on the other side of this, the side of dependence, of pain, of wondering if your body will ever cooperate again. He talked about his own long recovery, the frustration of the limp, the phantom pain in his missing toes. "The body remembers the trauma," Shannon said. "Your job isn't to forget it happened. Your job is to make peace with the memory." This was the true payoff, the resolution beyond the miracle. Their bond was no longer about the one-time dramatic rescue. It was about the long, unglamorous work of healing that comes after. It was about showing up. Shannon visited nearly every day. They walked the hospital corridors together, a slow procession of two men who had saved each other, now helping each other walk. They talked about everything except the fire and the crash. They talked about their families, about sports, about retirement. They talked about Porter. The normalcy of the conversation was the medicine Chris needed most. After Chris was discharged, their annual anniversary meeting took on a new gravity. That year, on March 29th, they met at a quiet cafe. The celebration was muted, grateful. They acknowledged the new layer to their story. "I guess we're even," Chris joked weakly. Shannon shook his head. "We were never keeping score," he said. "That was the point everyone missed. This was never a transaction, it was a conversation, and we're still talking." Chris's recovery forced him to confront the physical cost of his career. The stress, the erratic sleep, the adrenaline spikes, it had all kept a tally, just as Dr. Shannon's cardiologist had warned him years before. Chris became an advocate within his department for cardiac health screenings, for mental health support, for recognizing that the body of a rescuer is not indestructible. He spoke with the hard-won authority of a man who had learned the lesson the hardest way possible. And then the final surprising detail, the one that pushes the story from remarkable to enduring. In 2023, a young journalist, writing a retrospective on everyday miracles, tracked down both men. Chris Trokey was back on light duty, a training officer mentoring new recruits. Michael Shannon was fully retired, gardening and enjoying his grandchildren. The journalist asked the expected question: "What is the one thing you want people to understand about your story?" Chris answered first: "It's not about us. It's about the thousands of paramedics and doctors and firefighters who do this every day and never know what happens next. We got the movie version. They live the real one. Honor that." Shannon, when asked the same, paused for a long time. Then he said, "You know, I think the real miracle wasn't that Chris saved me, or that I saved him. The miracle is that we both had the chance to say thank you. Most people never get that. Most kindness is given into the void. We were given a receipt. Don't wait for a receipt to be kind. Their story, which began as a stunning coincidence, matured into a parable about sustained attention. It was about the doctor who paid attention to a failing infant beyond his shift. It was about the firefighter who paid attention to a name on a report and followed it to a hospital room. It was about both men paying attention to each other's pain long after the cameras left. The karma loop was just the flashy hook. The real story was the quiet thread of care that connected every chapter. As for Ike Randolph and Jacob Sukroff, their connection also deepened in its own way. They didn't become inseparable friends, but they kept in touch. Jacob invited Ike to his wedding. Ike sends Jacob's daughter a birthday card every year. It is a gentle, undemanding friendship, a thread reknit across decades. It proves there is no one right way for these stories to end. Sometimes the payoff is a loud, public reunion. Sometimes it's a quiet Christmas card. Both are valid. Both are whole. The narrative loop that began with a 2-pound baby is now complete, but the human relationship continues, evolving with each passing year. Chris Trokey and Michael Shannon still meet every March 29th. They talk about their health, their families, their memories. They are a living testament to a simple, powerful idea that we are all interconnected in ways we cannot see, and that an act of compassion is never an isolated event. It is a stone dropped in a pond, and the ripples move outward in time and space, touching shores we may never visit. Their story asks us the final, most important question. If you could see the ripples, would you be more careful with the stones? Would you be more likely to act to help, to stay, knowing that the echo might one day find its way back to you, not as a miracle, but as a quiet thank you in a hospital room or a friendship that spans generations? As the sun sets on another anniversary, two men, one a retired doctor, one a firefighter on light duty, sit across from each other. They are older. They have scars, both visible and invisible. They raise a glass of water, a silent toast to survival, to second chances, to the inexplicable geometry of life that sometimes draws a perfect circle. And then they talk about what's for dessert, because some miracles become ordinary, and that is the most beautiful ending of all. So what do we do with a story like this? We let it change the way we see the ordinary threads of our own lives. Because the profound truth hidden within the extraordinary coincidence is this: we are all part of unseen loops. The firefighter who stops to help you change a tire. The nurse who offers a kind word on a hard day. The stranger who returns your lost wallet. You have no idea where they've been or where they're going. You have no idea if you've crossed paths before in some invisible way, or if you will again. The story of Chris Trokey and Michael Shannon is not an instruction manual for how to get a miraculous reward. It is a powerful argument for acting as if such connections exist, for understanding that every single act of decency, of professionalism, of simple human care is sent out into a network we cannot map. Most of the time, we don't get a receipt. We don't get to see the circle close, but that doesn't mean the circle isn't there. It asks us a simple, haunting question. What are you putting into that network? Are you adding to the reservoir of compassion, or are you adding to the static of indifference? The doctor and the firefighter showed us that the most important thing you can do is your job, with full attention and full heart, without any expectation of a return. The return is not the point. The action is the point. Their story and the quieter one of Ike Randolph and Jacob Sukroff reminds us that heroes are not mythical. They are people who show up. They are people who see a need and meet it. They are people who, years later, still wonder if you're okay. And it reminds those who have been saved, whether from a fire, an illness, or a moment of despair, that your survival is someone else's answered prayer. Your life is their living hope. So carry this with you. The next time you have the chance to help, to listen, to stay a little longer, to look past the uniform or the diagnosis or the circumstance to see the person, do it. Do it not because you believe in karma, but because you believe in connection. Do it because you are weaving a thread into a tapestry you will never fully see. You might just be closing a loop you never knew was open, or starting one that will close for someone else 30 years from now. If this story touched you, subscribe to our channel. We are dedicated to uncovering more real-life narratives that reveal the hidden architecture of human grace, the quiet choices that echo across decades. Tap like if this message resonated with you. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that no act of kindness is ever too small, and that we are all capable of being someone's miracle. In the comments, tell us, have you ever experienced a moment where a small act of kindness came back to you, or where you discovered a hidden connection that changed your perspective? We read every story, and we are truly honored to share this space with you. Thank you for watching. May you move through your days with the courage to care deeply and the openness to see the extraordinary threads woven through your ordinary life. Remember, the next loop is always beginning. Be the one who starts it.